Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. I'm just going to introduce myself quickly. My name is Rizwan Safir. I'm an archaeologist. What does that mean? It means I study the ancient history of us. And just by way of background, I'm currently working at the British Museum. And my background is in Middle Eastern archaeology. So I've worked mainly across the Middle East over the last 7 years. Jordan and Egypt, Israel, Qatar, but also in the UK and in Europe. And what I want to introduce today is a very interesting topic. And it's really born from an idea. And it's an idea which took root about 10,000 years ago. But it's an idea which affects all of us today. In fact, this very building and all the things that we have would not have existed if it was not for this revolution which took place around 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. So before I get onto that, I want to start with a quote. And it's a quote from Winston Churchill. And it says, "The farther back you look, the farther forward you can see." Now, what does that mean? Of course, it sounds like one of those wishy-washy quotes that you generally hear, but it's actually very pertinent because if you look at the history, if you look in the past and you look at the examples of the past, it provides us with an outlook of what can potentially happen. If we forget the past, we can easily fall into the traps going into the future. If we think of things quite recently, such as slavery, even if you think of in the Quran continually asks us to look at the examples of humans in the past and look at the example of where they have gone wrong, or even where they have gone right, and how we can benefit from that example. And this particular example that I want to speak of today refers to an idea which is also something that can, if we don't realize it, can potentially have pitfalls going forward. And it refers to the concept of agriculture. Now, 10,000 years ago, or before 10,000 years ago, to picture the scene, prior to 10,000 years ago, before we started developing agriculture, human beings lived in very small groups. We lived in groups of about 5 to 15 people. We were very nomadic in our existence, which means what we had to do to survive, we would roam the landscape in search for different means of food. We were hunter-gatherers, so we'd hunt animals, and we would gather whatever wild cereals or resources were available to us. That was our lifestyle. But around 10,000 years ago, this concept began to change, and what I want to talk about quickly during my talk is why it changed. So the root of this is after the last ice age. Now, humanity's timeline is divided into different geological time zones, and we are currently in the Holocene, or actually I'll refer to something later, but the last ice age was in a period called the Pleistocene. Now, if we picture the scene of what was happening after the last ice age, Britain was still connected to Europe, water levels were a lot lower, ice sheets had encapsulated most of northern Europe. It was entirely frozen. Humans couldn't live in the area. Of course, temperatures were a lot colder. You could walk from the UK to Europe. So the concept of a Brexit would have been a lot more difficult in that time than it is today. You'd have to build like a Donald Trump-style wall across the UK to keep people out. But temperatures were generally warming. And we entered this period called the Holocene. And areas became more fertile, particularly in the Middle East. And what I want to refer to is a specific stretch of land in the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent. In this area, there were certain crops which grew in the wild. And these crops formed the fundamental basis of all the areas or all the sources of agriculture that we have today. There are 3 crops in particular: wheat, barley, and einkorn. And humans were benefiting from this. You see, just before the Neolithic period, we were becoming we were still nomadic completely, but we developed more sophistication in our repertoire of hunting, of gathering. But an event happened, and that event is referred to as the Younger Dryas. And what happened was, as temperatures were beginning to warm, suddenly there was a dramatic dip in temperature. People aren't quite sure why this happened, but it was a huge dip. And a lot of the resources that we had available to us had vanished. So humans had to interact in a different way. And what they found is that they had to stay closer to the sources of these wild crops. And through a very slow process of living in these areas and dealing with these crops, we slowly began to learn how to manage them and tame them. But in fact, it was almost the other way around. Because we were so reliant on these crops, it was almost the crops that tamed us. And what started happening is that people started expressing themselves in different ways. And there's a lot of different things which are happening in this period, but I want to really just define it into a few. The first thing which happens is, because of these crops, we have to stay in certain areas for longer periods. So we become sedentary. We start to form communities. This is the first time this has ever happened. It's a strange concept. And if you think of you're living in a landscape of 5 to 10 people and you're moving continually, your language is very limited. You don't really have to communicate in very sophisticated forms because that's how you live. But as soon as you start to interact with more people on a regular basis, it becomes difficult to limit yourself to very few forms of language. In the same way as we're in a social media age, social media has forced us to communicate in different ways. This is the beginning of social media in the sense that people are living together in sustained environments. So you start to get weird forms of expression. Now this is in the British Museum, this object I want to refer to. It was found at a site in Jordan called Ain Ghazal, and it's a series of lime plaster statues. These are the first ever human-size statues ever made or ever known in human history. So people are starting to express themselves in the same ways that we create modern statues of famous people or individuals. People are starting to express self-identity. Consciousness becomes more of a greater concept. You start to get strange forms of ritual concepts. So these are skulls found at the site of Jericho where the bodies were beheaded. They were then encased in plaster. The eyes were removed. The shells were inserted. They would often be painted. So very, very strange concepts of consciousness were taking place. Pottery starts to develop. Pottery seems like a very mundane, boring thing, but it's the essence of storage. And storage allows you to have foresight and plan. But not only that, there were forms of cultural identity in pottery. So you find across a broad landscape people painting pots in a very particular way and identifying with each other. Now that's the first time this ever happens. In the same way that we, as Ahmadis, we wear certain topis or clothing that you can almost identify this person is from this group. This was the first time that people are identifying with a particular group. We started domesticating animals. So cattle, sheep and goat, this is the first time that we started controlling them. And also, you start to have other pursuits such as stone tools, which we'd been using for millions of years. This is an example of a polished stone tool, which would have taken hours and hours of time to perfect and smooth, but had no use. It had never been used. There's no sign on this at all of being in use. So a lot of strange things happening, but at the same time, it's not as if it was widely adopted. It was actually resisted at the beginning. So we look at the period before. This is the average age. Look at the period after. In the Neolithic, there's a dramatic dip. Why does this happen? Well, a lot of issues happen when people start living together. You start to get viral and infectious diseases start taking place. So you've got influenza, smallpox, measles, sanitation, of course. When you're nomadic, you use the toilet in one place, you move on, there's no issue. If you're staying in one place, of course, sanitation becomes an issue. Zoonotic diseases transferred from animals. It's the first time we start to see that taking place. So the evidence we use for this, archaeologists use teeth. Teeth are a very good example of determining people's health. And you start to get a lot of dental caries because we're relying more on carbohydrates, whereas before we almost entirely relied on protein. So a lot of issues are taking place at this time. But at the same time, and I want to go back to the language issue and communication, we have incredible feats of architecture which had never been seen before. This is the site of Ain Ghazal in Turkey. It's on the border with Turkey and Syria. And I don't know if you can see, these are monoliths or stone structures. This is the actual site, and this is an illustration. And what they found here is that there's no evidence of settlement whatsoever. No one is living here, but huge architectural undertakings are taking place. People are constructing giant buildings. Some of these T-shaped monoliths are about 2 meters in height or even more. And if you consider the amount of organization, the amount of administration, the amount of cohesion that would need for people, I mean, it would be difficult to undertake something like this in the modern day and age. And bear in mind, this is before the wheel was invented, before any machinery, before camels or donkeys were domesticated, before horses were in use. So this was entirely done by human endeavor. So there's a lot happening in this period. And this idea spreads. So what happens is, its core is in the Middle East, and continue over thousands of years, it eventually spreads across here down to Egypt and Sudan. It goes across to Asia, and eventually also spreads into Europe. And around 4,000 years after it first comes about in the Middle East, it reaches the UK, or Britain. And we start to see similarities in the culture that I was referring to earlier. So we had Göbekli Tepe earlier, Stonehenge. Stonehenge is from the same period, the Neolithic. And you see almost the same forms of expression taking place. A stone structure, circular stone structure. People would flock from miles just to attend it. There's no evidence of settlement around the area. So these ideas begin to take hold. Now, what is the importance of this idea? And I want to just come and end on this point. So I mentioned before that there's different epochs in history. We have the Pleistocene, where the Ice Age happened. We have the Holocene, where this warming period happened. And scientists have just recently begun to refer to a new period in human history. It was only about a couple of weeks ago which came on the news. It's referred to as the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is a mark that humans, we have left on human history. And they refer to it from about 1960 up until today, where we have left such an imprint on the planet that it will be distinct for future generations to determine. Now, it's cheating in the sense because actually it takes thousands of years before you can identify these markers in the geology. So we're actually predetermining what's happening. But there's no doubt that in thousands of years, people will look back and see from around 1960 onwards, we have left such a distinct mark on this planet. And this is the site, it's in the Arctic, in Norway, in Svalbard, and it's called the Global Seed Bank. And what scientists have begun to do is they've realized that there is an issue. There's an issue with the way we're treating the environment, there's an issue with the way that pollution is taking hold. And they've gathered all the different crops that we know of in the entire world today and stored it in this freezing ice unit in the Arctic. So I just want to end on this note and think about the lessons that we can learn from the past. Now we struggled to undertake this revolution of agriculture. And it allowed us to be in this room today and have all the benefits of society. But at the same time, if we don't realize what's happening to our planet, we realize the footprint we're leaving on the planet, we might have to resort to some of these extreme measures to store the fruits of our labor or the tenets of our history. But I don't want to leave on a doom and gloom kind of topic. As you'll hear today, there's many innovative ways that us as humans are engaging in new ways to come up with solutions, such as solar power or whatever it may be. But it's just important for us to learn from the lessons of the past. Jazakallah.